Chapter 1. The cold stone floor bit ruthlessly into Yvaine's knees. Heavy iron cuffs anchored her wrists to the ground, the chains rattling softly with every breath she took. Around her, the great hall of the north murmured with cruel, hungry anticipation. Hundreds of eyes bored into her back. The air smelled of frost, wet fur, and impending death. Lord Malzar stepped forward, his heavy boots clicking sharply against the polished obsidian floor. He grabbed a handful of Yvaine's hair, yanking her head back. "A tribute, Your Grace," Malzar announced. His voice echoed off the high, vaulted ceilings. "The last of her wretched bloodline. We found her trying to cross the border." Corvus did not look at Malzar. The immortal Wolf King sat perfectly still on his throne. He rested his chin on a clenched fist. His piercing golden eyes locked entirely on Yvaine. He wore no crown, only a heavy mantle of black wolf fur draped over his broad shoulders. He didn't need gold to command the room. His presence didn't just fill the hall. It suffocated it. "She doesn't look like much of a tribute," Corvus said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "She is broken, my king," Malzar insisted quickly, stepping closer to the throne. He gave Yvaine's hair another vicious tug. "A stray dog from the ruined southern lands. A little weaver who forgot how to speak. Do with her as you please. Tell her to look at me. Look at your king, stray." Malzar spat. Yvaine didn't lower her gaze. Her jaw tightened. She ignored Malzar completely, keeping her chin high, meeting the eyes of the tyrant who had supposedly slaughtered her people. "I don't take orders from traitors," Yvaine said. Her voice was completely steady. Malzar's face twisted in rage. He raised a mailed hand to strike her. "You insolent. Touch her again, Malzar, and I will rip that arm from your socket." Corvus didn't raise his voice. He didn't move. But the absolute authority in his tone froze Malzar instantly. The Lord slowly lowered his hand, stepping away from the chained girl. Corvus stood. The whispers in the hall died instantly. Not a single person dared to breathe. He descended the steps. The air grew impossibly dense, charged with the scent of ozone and encroaching winter. The heavy alpha aura radiating off him forced several guards to avert their eyes. He stopped mere inches from her. He towered over her kneeling form, blocking out the light of the torches. Slowly, he reached down. His large, heavily calloused fingers caught her jaw, tilting her face up. His touch was burning hot against her freezing skin. "Are you broken, little tribute?" he asked softly. Yvaine smiled. A cold, reckless curve of her lips. "Kneel," she whispered. It wasn't a request. It was a weaver's command. The single word pulsed through the air like a kinetic shockwave. The shadows clinging to the pillars violently snapped alive. They whipped across the floor like dark chains, coiling around the legs of the guards standing near her. They surged upward, wrapping tightly around Malzar's throat. No one screamed. The shadows stole their breath. Dozens of heavily armored men dropped to their knees in dead silence, their eyes wide with sudden, choking terror. Malzar clawed frantically at his own throat, his face turning a dark shade of purple. Corvus's eyes flared with sudden, sharp intrigue. In that split second of distraction, Yvaine twisted her bound wrists. The iron cuffs had been an illusion she wove hours ago. A hidden bone knife slid from her sleeve directly into her palm. She lunged upward, driving her weight forward with everything she had. The blade sank to the hilt, dead center into his chest. "Break," she whispered. Another command. Cold. Final. Corvus didn't fall. He didn't even pull away. Instead, his massive hand slammed over hers, trapping her pale fingers against the hilt. Before she could react, he stepped forward. Yvaine choked on a gasp as the movement drove the blade entirely through his body. The hilt cracked hard against his sternum. He used the sheer force of his momentum to drive her backward, sweeping her off her feet and slamming her spine against an icy stone pillar. He pinned her there, willingly impaling himself further just to close the distance between them. He tilted his head. His golden eyes were wide, the pupils blown completely black. A jagged, breathless laugh scraped out of his throat. It wasn't the laugh of a controlled king. It was the sound of a starving, unhinged beast. "Push harder," he rasped, his chest pressed flush against her knuckles. Yvaine stared in sheer horror, her weaver magic flaring uselessly against his skin. "You should be dead. I haven't been alive for a century." Corvus gripped the hilt of the knife over her hand. With one violent, completely smooth motion, he ripped the weapon out of his own chest. There was no blood. Only a thick, suffocating black smoke poured from the gaping wound. The dark mist hissed angrily, wrapping around his skin and aggressively stitching his flesh back together in the blink of an eye. He tossed the knife. It shattered against the stone floor. Yvaine tried to pull away, panic finally breaking through her cold facade. His hand shot out. His heavy, smoke-stained fingers wrapped around the front of her throat. Not to choke. To hold. His thumb pressed firmly over her racing pulse. "You came to kill a monster," Corvus murmured, his voice dropping to a vibrating, guttural purr. He leaned in so close she could feel the unnatural heat radiating off his body. "But you didn't think I'd want to keep you. I'd rather burn." She spat, her chest heaving. Her heart was hammering frantically against his palm. Done. He didn't bite his wrist. He didn't offer a polite drop of blood. Corvus dragged his thumb across his own freshly closed wound. He caught a single, searing bead of liquid fire, alpha blood, boiling with the ancient curse of the North. He gripped her jaw tightly, forcing her to look directly into his blackened eyes, and smeared the blood directly across her lips. The moment the blood touched her, Yvaine screamed. It wasn't physical pain. It was absolute invasion. A massive, invisible weight slammed into her chest, knocking the air from her lungs. The shadows in the room violently recoiled, releasing the choking guards. She felt his heartbeat. It didn't just echo in her ears. It slammed inside her own ribs. Slow, heavy, deafening. The invisible, heavy chain of magic snapped tight around her soul, tethering her frantic pulse directly to his steady, rhythmic heartbeat. The scent of him pine, smoke, and raw, dominating power flooded her senses, clouding her mind completely. He stepped back just enough to let her slide down the pillar. She hit the floor, gasping for air, her hands flying to her chest. She touched her lips. They were burning, stained with a faint, golden glow. Around them, the hall was in absolute chaos. Guards coughed violently, drawing their swords. Malzar gasped for breath on the floor, pointing a trembling finger at her. "Kill her!" Malzar wheezed. "She's an assassin! Kill the witch!" Swords cleared their scabbards. A dozen men rushed forward. "Stand down!" Corvus's roar shook the very foundations of the castle. The sound was purely animalistic, vibrating with an alpha command so absolute that the advancing guards immediately dropped to their knees, dropping their weapons. Silence slammed back into the room. Corvus turned back to Yvaine. He looked down at her, his chest heaving slightly, his eyes blazing with a terrifying, absolute obsession. "A blood pact," Corvus declared to the dead silent hall. His voice brooked no argument. He pointed a single clawed finger at Yvaine. "Her life is tied to mine." Yvaine glared up at him, her vision swimming from the overwhelming bond. "What did you do to me?" she demanded, her voice shaking. Corvus crouched down. He ignored the hundreds of people watching them. He reached out, his knuckles brushing lightly against her burning cheek. "If I breathe, you breathe," he whispered, a lethal promise meant only for her. "If I die," he leaned closer, the ghost of a dark smile touching his lips, "you burn with me. Welcome to the North, little weaver." Chapter 2. The freezing wind of the Deadlands howled through the barren trees, violently whipping Yvaine's thin linen dress. She stopped walking. 10 paces ahead, Corvus stopped too. He didn't turn around. The invisible, suffocating tether of their blood pact snapped taut between them. Every time his massive heart beat, the phantom chain jerked sharply against Yvaine's ribs. "Walk," Corvus commanded. His voice cut easily through the howling wind. I'm not taking another step until you tell me what we're hunting. Corvus slowly turned. His heavy wolf fur mantle shifted, dusting off a layer of fresh snow. He stared at her, his golden eyes indifferent to the biting cold. I didn't give you a choice, Weaver. Yvaine held his gaze. Her body was shivering violently, but her voice was dead calm. A blood pact is a two-way street, Your Grace. Without breaking eye contact, Yvaine raised a hand to her mouth. She deliberately bit down hard on her own bottom lip. Her teeth broke the skin. A sharp, stinging pain flared. A split second later, Corvus flinched. His hand shot to his mouth. He wiped his thumb across his lower lip, pulling it back to see a phantom smear of red. He tasted the metallic tang of copper in the back of his throat. He felt her pain. Yvaine smiled, real blood staining her teeth. You tied yourself to immortal. That makes you mortal too. So start talking. Corvus didn't look angry. The pitch-black pupils of his eyes expanded, swallowing the gold entirely. He closed the distance between them in 3 massive, predatory strides. His boots crushing the snow. Yvaine didn't back away. He stopped right in front of her. He didn't yell. He didn't grab her. He simply leaned down, his face inches from hers, the unnatural heat radiating off him fighting the blizzard. Do that again, Corvus whispered, his voice a gravelly deadpan promise. Yvaine's breath hitched. She saw the absolute stillness in his blackened eyes. It wasn't an empty alpha threat. He was genuinely calculating the physical effort of carrying her broken body. You're insane, she breathed. I'm impatient. Corvus stepped back, the oppressive weight of his aura easing just enough for her to breathe. There is an anomaly in the mountain. A tumor in reality. Yvaine frowned, the cold momentarily forgotten. What kind of anomaly? The kind that doesn't bleed when you stab it, Corvus said flatly. The kind that wears the faces of the dead, speaking in voices of people you buried. My armies go in. And they come back. Wrong. They come back missing pieces of their minds, talking to empty air. A cold dread, entirely separate from the winter wind, curled in Yvaine's stomach. The puzzle pieces didn't fit together cleanly, but the shape they formed was horrifying. You can't kill it with steel, Yvaine realized aloud, her voice dropping. So you need someone to rewrite the rule that says it exists. You need an eraser. Corvus stared at her. I need you to unwrite a nightmare. And if it unmakes me first, then we both die. Corvus turned his back to her, resuming his march. Keep moving, little weapon. We have a long walk. By nightfall, the temperature plummeted to lethal levels. Corvus set up a small camp beneath the hollowed roots of a massive, dead ironwood tree. He built a fire effortlessly, the flames roaring to life with a single snap of his fingers. Yvaine sat on the far side of the roots, entirely swallowed by the shadows. She pulled her knees to her chest. Her lips were turning blue, her teeth chattering so violently her jaw ached. Corvus sat by the fire, sharpening a long, curved bone blade. He didn't look at her. Sit by the fire. I'm fine, Yvaine lied. You're freezing. I prefer the cold. She dug her nails into her arms. Accepting his fire meant accepting his control. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. The sharp scraping of the whetstone against the bone blade stopped. Corvus sighed. He stood up. He didn't walk over to coddle her or drag her to the fire. Instead, he unclasped the massive, heavy wolf fur mantle from his shoulders. He threw it across the darkness. The heavy fur landed squarely over Yvaine, burying her in instant, overwhelming warmth. The mantle completely engulfed her. The moment the fabric hit her face, her senses were violently assaulted by his scent: crushed pine, dark smoke, and the intoxicating, spicy heat of a pure alpha. She pushed the heavy fur down to glare at him. I didn't ask for this. Corvus sat back down by the fire, wearing only a thin black tunic that tightly gripped the heavy muscles of his chest. The freezing wind didn't seem to affect him at all. Your shivering is echoing in my chest, Corvus said. not looking up from his blade. "It's a pathetic rhythm, and it distracts me. Wrap up, or I'll knock you unconscious, so you stop feeling the cold." Yvaine gripped the edges of the mantle. She wanted to throw it back at him, but the aggressive, territorial heat of his body trapped in the fur was too much to resist. Slowly, grudgingly, she pulled it tighter around her shoulders. "You're a tyrant," she muttered. "And you're loud. Go to sleep." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. The crackle of the fire was the only sound for hours. Yvaine watched him through half-closed eyes, the ruthless Wolf King, sitting guard in the dead of night, forcing her to sleep in his own armor not out of kindness, but out of possessive irritation. Suddenly, the fire died. It didn't burn out. It was snuffed out completely, plunging the camp into absolute, suffocating darkness. Yvaine snapped, fully awake. The air dropped 20 degrees in a single second. A thick, unnatural white mist rolled into the hollowed roots, carrying the sickly sweet stench of rotting flowers. From the fog, a dozen pairs of glowing, hollow eyes opened. Low, wet, gargling growls echoed off the dead trees. Mist stalkers, behemoths of the deadlands. Yvaine scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering against her ribs. The blood pact violently transmitted her spike of raw panic straight to Corvus. He was already standing, but he didn't draw his sword, he didn't shift into a wolf, he didn't even raise his hands to defend them. Corvus simply took a step back, leaving the space between the monsters and Yvaine completely open. He crossed his arms over his chest, his golden eyes glowing faintly in the dark. A massive beast, its body a twisting mass of shadow and bone, lunged forward, snapping its jaws inches from Yvaine's face. She flinched, waiting for the Wolf King to rip the thing apart. He didn't move. Corvus tilted his head, a dark, provoking smirk touching his lips as he looked directly at her. "Well?" Corvus asked casually over the snarling of the beasts. "Are you going to save your husband, little bird? Or are we both dying tonight?" Chapter 3. The massive beast snapped its jaws less than an inch from Yvaine's face. The stench of rot and wet earth hit her like a physical blow. Corvus stood 5 paces away, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't blink. He was watching her, not the beast, waiting for her to break. Yvaine didn't scream. She didn't cower. She locked eyes with the Wolf King through the chaotic mass of snapping teeth and fog. "You bastard," she whispered. Before the monster could sink its fangs into her throat, a wall of floating, shattered mirrors materialized violently out of thin air. The beast slammed face first into the illusion, howling in confusion as it attacked its own distorted, infinite reflections. A figure dropped from the dead branches above, landing gracefully in the thick snow. "I track your psychotic ass through a blizzard for 2 days, and you don't even say hello?" Phaedra straightened up, dusting snow off her heavily embroidered leather coat. The illusionist spun twin silver daggers in her hands, her sharp purple eyes glaring daggers at Corvus. "You're late, Phaedra," Corvus said flatly, not moving an inch. "There's a horde of dead things out here, in case you missed it," Phaedra yelled, dodging a massive claw that swiped through her mirror shield. The illusion cracked, sending shards of false light scattering into the fog. "Are you going to kill them, or just stand there looking dramatic?" "I'm not killing them," Corvus replied. A dark, terrifying grin spread across his face. He tilted his head toward Yvaine. "She is." Phaedra briefly glanced at the shivering girl wrapped in the oversized wolf mantle. "Her? The hostage? Are you out of your mind?" "Watch," Corvus commanded softly. Another stalker lunged from the fog, bypassing the mirrors completely. It aimed straight for Phaedra's blind spot, its jaw unhinging to reveal rows of jagged bone. Phaedra cursed, raising her daggers, knowing she didn't have time to weave another shield. "Phaedra, drop!" Yvaine ordered. The cold vanished. The fear evaporated. Yvaine didn't draw a weapon. She didn't close her eyes to pray to any god. She simply stepped forward, looking at the charging horde of nightmare creatures, and opened her mouth. Vitrum. It was a single weaver's command. Glass. She didn't shout. It was a harsh whisper, but it didn't travel through the air. It bypassed the laws of physics entirely, directly rewriting the code of reality within a 50-foot radius. The sound of the howling wind abruptly died. The world hit a violent mute button. Mid-leap, the miststalkers froze. Their thick, sludgy flesh violently hardened. The black decay turned instantly smooth and translucent. In less than a second, 14 massive, terrifying beasts were transformed into perfectly sculpted statues of jagged, black obsidian glass. Absolute silence fell over the Deadlands. Then, Yvaine flicked her index finger. Crack. A high-pitched, agonizing frequency shattered the silence. The 14 glass statues detonated simultaneously. There was no blood. There was no gore. Just a spectacular, blinding explosion of black crystal dust raining down upon the white snow like dark ash. Phaedra dropped her daggers, her jaw unhinged. She stared at the glittering black dust coating her boots. What? What the hell is she? Corvus walked through the falling dark ash. He didn't look impressed. He looked entirely, dangerously obsessed. The unhinged monster from the throne room was fully back. He stopped right in front of Yvaine. Slowly, he reached out and caught a falling shard of black glass before it could hit her cheek. He crushed it into dust between his fingers, smearing the dark residue across his own thumb. Then, keeping his golden eyes locked on hers, he brought his thumb to his mouth and tasted the destruction she had just caused. Absolute ruin, Corvus murmured. His voice was a heavy, vibrating purr. You could unmake the world with a whisper. Yvaine didn't back down from his overwhelming aura. She stepped closer, tipping her chin up. I could unmake you. I invite you to try. He leaned in, his gaze dropping to her lips. But you're bleeding, little weapon. Yvaine frowned. She reached up and touched her philtrum. Her fingers came away slick. It wasn't red blood. It was pitch black, thick and heavy like oil. The devastating toll of forcing reality to bend. Suddenly, her vision violently doubled. She looked past Corvus, down at the snow. One head of the mist stalkers hadn't completely shattered. It lay in the snowdrift, a frozen block of black glass, but as Yvaine stared at it, the glass eyes moved. They weren't the hollow, dead eyes of a beast anymore. They were human, golden, familiar, and utterly terrified. A voice echoed directly inside Yvaine's mind. Not a growl. A clear, desperate whisper of a young boy. Evie, why did you drop the string? Yvaine stopped breathing. Her heart skipped a violent, painful beat. That was her childhood nickname. That was her twin brother's voice. The brother who died screaming 10 years ago. No, Yvaine gasped, stumbling backward. She clutched the sides of her head, her breath coming in short, erratic pants. No, that's a trick. That's not real. What did you see? Corvus demanded. His voice was suddenly sharp, the playful, dark edge vanishing instantly. It spoke to me. Yvaine's voice trembled. She pointed a shaking finger at the shattered glass head. It had his eyes. My brother's eyes. Phaedra exchanged a tense, grim look with Corvus. I told you the god in the mountain alters reality, Corvus said coldly. He moved, stepping deliberately between Yvaine and the severed glass head, blocking her view. It doesn't just twist flesh. It wears your ghosts. It feeds on the things you couldn't save. It wants you to hesitate. You knew, Yvaine whispered. The horror morphed instantly into a burning, raw betrayal. You knew it would use my memories. You brought me into a psychological slaughterhouse. I brought you to do a job, Corvus shot back, his tone ruthless. Shut your mind off and do it. You sick, manipulative. Yvaine lunged at him, her hands raised to shove his chest. but her legs suddenly gave out completely. The magic backlash hit her like a derailed train. Her mortal body violently rejected the massive expenditure of Weaver energy. She collapsed into the snow, coughing violently. More black blood splattered against the pure white ground, staining it with her decaying life force. Through the invisible tether of the blood pact, the impact hit Corvus instantly. The immortal Wolf King staggered mid-step. A sharp, ugly sound of genuine pain tore from his throat. He dropped hard to one knee, a massive hand flying to his own chest. His heart, the unstoppable engine of the North, was rapidly slowing down, violently mimicking the dying, erratic rhythm of the girl in the snow. Black veins suddenly spiderwebbed up Corvus's neck, pulsing wildly beneath his skin. He gritted his teeth, his claws extending and digging deep into the frozen earth as he fought for a breath that simply wouldn't come. He looked at Yvaine. She lay motionless in the snow, her eyes rolling back, her skin turning the color of ash. He had chained his immortal life to a mortal weapon, and the weapon was breaking. "Phaedra," Corvus choked out. His golden eyes flickered, the pupils expanding as darkness edged into his vision. His voice was a ragged, desperate growl. "Keep her alive, or we all burn." Chapter 4. The world was spinning into darkness. Corvus couldn't breathe. Every time Yvaine's heart stuttered, a phantom blade twisted in his chest. The immortal Wolf King, who had survived 100 wars and 1,000 assassins, was being dragged into the grave by a shivering, bleeding girl in the snow. "Corvus!" Phaedra yelled, grabbing his massive shoulder. "You're suffocating! Break the pact! Break it now, or she'll drag you to hell with her." "No." Corvus violently shoved Phaedra's hand away. He forced himself to stand. His legs shook a sight no one in the North had ever witnessed. Black veins pulsed rapidly up his neck, mapping the magical poison spreading from Yvaine's exhausted body into his. He ignored the agony. He scooped Yvaine's limp body out of the snow, pulling her tightly against his chest. She weighed almost nothing. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her skin terrifyingly cold. "Where are you going?" Phaedra demanded, chasing after him. "She shattered reality, Corvus. A mortal vessel cannot survive that level of Weaver magic. Her organs are literally turning to ash." "Find cover," Corvus ground out through clenched teeth. "Keep the stragglers away." "You can't save her." Corvus stopped. He turned his head, his blackened, dying eyes locking onto the illusionist. "I am the king of the North. I decide who dies in my lands." He didn't wait for a response. He carried Yvaine toward the hollowed roots of the massive ironwood tree they had camped under. He slid into the dark, enclosed space, pulling the heavy wolf fur mantle over them to block out the freezing wind and the sight of the world outside. It was pitch black. The air was suffocatingly tight. Corvus leaned back against the jagged wood, settling Yvaine across his lap. He pressed his ear to her chest. Her heartbeat was a fading, erratic flutter. He didn't have minutes. He had seconds. "Wake up, Weaver," he commanded, his voice a hoarse, desperate rasp. She didn't move. Corvus extended his left arm. He didn't hesitate. He drove the razor-sharp edge of his right index claw straight into the veins of his own wrist. He dragged the claw down, tearing a deep, jagged line through his flesh. No crimson blood spilled. Instead, a violently bright, red-gold mist hissed from the open skin. It was pure, unfiltered alpha life force. It glowed in the dark hollow, illuminating their faces in a harsh, fiery light. The raw magic smelled like burning pine, ozone, and absolute power. Corvus grabbed the back of Yvaine's neck, tipping her head back. He pressed his open, glowing wrist directly against her lips. "Breathe," he ordered. She didn't respond. Corvus swore under his breath. He shifted his grip, his heavy fingers tangling in her hair. He leaned down, burying his face in the crook of her neck, and crushed his bleeding wrist harder against her mouth. "I said, breathe, damn you," he growled, the command vibrating through his chest and into hers. "You don't get to die to escape me. Take it." The sheer dominance in his voice forced a physical reaction. Yvaine's body convulsed. Her mouth opened on a sharp, involuntary gasp. The glowing red-gold smoke poured instantly into her lungs. The reaction was violent and immediate. Yvaine's back arched off his lap. Her hands flew up, her fingers digging desperately into his shoulders like claws. The ancient, immortal heat flooded her freezing veins, violently hunting down the black decay of the magic backlash and burning it away. Corvus didn't let her pull away. He held her clamped against him, forcing her to consume his life force. Her heavy, frantic breaths mingled completely with his. In the suffocating confines of the hollow tree, the intimacy was heavy, predatory, and absolute. He watched the ash-gray color fade from her cheeks, replaced by a sudden, feverish flush. But as she burned brighter, Corvus dimmed. The unyielding, terrifying monster finally showed a crack. His broad shoulders slumped against the tree. The golden rings in his eyes dulled. A heavy, ragged sigh, the sound of a man carrying a century of sheer exhaustion, escaped his lips. He let his forehead drop, resting it heavily against hers in the glowing dark. For a terrifying, suspended moment, the King of the North looked entirely vulnerable. Yvaine's eyes snapped open. She gasped, her chest heaving as she sucked in the cold air. The first thing she saw was the glowing wound on his wrist. The second thing she felt was the massive, oppressive weight of his body pressing her down, his face inches from hers, their breaths sharing the exact same space. She shoved hard against his chest. "Get off me." Corvus didn't fight her. He leaned back slowly, his chest rising and falling in heavy, labored rhythms. The glowing wound on his wrist hissed, the smoke retreating as the skin sluggishly stitched itself back together. Yvaine scrambled to the opposite side of the hollow roots, wiping her mouth. Her lips tingled, burning with his residual heat. She felt powerful, terrifyingly energized. The sickening ache of the magic backlash was completely gone. She looked at Corvus. He looked wrecked. His skin was pale, and the dark circles under his eyes were prominent. "What did you do?" Yvaine demanded, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and confusion. "I fixed my weapon," Corvus said flatly. His voice lacked its usual booming resonance. It sounded incredibly tired. "You poured your own lifespan into me." Yvaine stared at him, her chest tight. The blood pact thrummed between them, singing with his raw energy. "Why? If I died, the pact would have taken a piece of you, but you would have survived. You're immortal." Corvus met her gaze. The vulnerability she thought she saw a moment ago was instantly walled off, replaced by his usual cold, cynical armor. "I don't leave my tools broken in the dirt," he sneered. "Don't mistake practicality for sentiment, Weaver. I need you to speak the word that kills the god. Nothing else matters." "You're a liar," Yvaine fired back, refusing to let him hide. "I felt your mind when you forced that smoke down my throat. I felt 100 years of absolute isolation. You didn't do it for a mission." Corvus's jaw tightened dangerously. He leaned forward, the shadows catching the sharp angles of his face. "Careful, little bird," he warned, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "Do not pretend you know what is inside my head. You are alive because I allow it. Remember that. I am alive because you are terrified of being alone," Yvaine stated. It wasn't a question. It was a direct, emotional strike. Silence slammed into the hollow tree. Corvus stared at her. His blackened eyes searched her face, looking for fear, but finding only a defiant, infuriating intelligence. He opened his mouth to reply, to crush her assumption with cruelty. Boom! A massive, unnatural shockwave shook the ground, rattling the dead wood of their shelter. The heavy fog outside the hollow violently dispersed, swept away by a gale-force wind. The sudden influx of gray daylight flooded the camp. Phaedra's voice cut through the air, shrill and panicked. "Corvus! Get out here, now!" Corvus didn't break eye contact with Yvaine. He simply rose to his feet, throwing the wolf fur mantle over his shoulders to hide his exhaustion. "We will finish this conversation later. I'm counting on it," Yvaine muttered, pushing herself up. She followed him out of the hollow tree. The Deadlands had changed. the suffocating white fog was entirely gone. In its place, less than half a mile away, stood the colossal, obsidian gates of an ancient temple, carved directly into the side of the Black Mountain. But it wasn't the architecture that made Yvaine freeze in her tracks. It was the figure standing at the top of the sweeping stone stairs. He didn't look like a monstrous god. He didn't look like a twisting anomaly of reality. He looked perfectly human. He wore the white and gold robes of the Southern Weaver Academy's garments that hadn't existed for a decade. He had messy blonde hair and bright, golden eyes. Corvus's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his blade. The air around him dropped in temperature, his alpha aura flaring aggressively. Yvaine couldn't breathe. The red-gold energy of the Wolf King in her veins suddenly ran ice-cold. The figure at the top of the stairs tilted his head. He looked down at the ruined camp, his eyes locking directly onto Yvaine. A voice, clear and perfectly calm, echoed not just in her mind, but across the entire valley. "You're late, Yvie." The boy smiled, a chilling, hollow expression. "I've been waiting for you to come home." Yvaine's knees gave out. Corvus caught her by the arm before she hit the snow, his grip tight and unyielding. She stared up at the boy on the stairs. The boy she had buried with her own hands 10 years ago. "Elian," Yvaine whispered, a tear of pure, unfiltered terror slipping down her cheek. The god in the mountain wasn't just wearing her brother's face. It was her brother. Chapter 5. The wind howling through the Deadlands completely died. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and wrong. Yvaine couldn't look away from the top of the obsidian stairs. Her entire body trembled violently against Corvus's iron grip. "Elian," she whispered again. The name felt like broken glass in her throat. The boy tilted his head. He looked exactly as he had the day he died, 16 years old, wearing the pristine white and gold robes of a Weaver initiate, but his shadow, stretching long and distorted across the black stone, didn't belong to a human. It writhed, twisting into shapes of jagged teeth and reaching claws. "You look so tired, Weavie," Elian said. His voice was perfectly clear, carrying the warm, teasing affection he used to have. It made Yvaine's stomach heave. "But you're finally here. Lord Malzar promised you would bring the Wolf King to me." Yvaine froze. The red-gold alpha heat still humming in her veins suddenly felt like ice. She ripped her arm out of Corvus's grip and stumbled back, her wide eyes snapping between the immortal tyrant and her resurrected brother. "Malzar," Yvaine choked out, shaking her head. "No. Malzar brought me to the north as a tribute. He sold me to the king to stop the slaughter of our people." "Oh, Yvie," Elian sighed. It was a terrifyingly gentle sound. He slowly descended the first 3 steps. As his boot touched the stone, a patch of white lilies instantly bloomed from the dead rock, only to rapidly rot into black sludge a second later. "The North never slaughtered us. We slaughtered them." "Stop talking," Corvus commanded. His voice wasn't a yell. It was a lethal, vibrating growl that shook the earth. He stepped in front of Yvaine, completely shielding her from the boy on the stairs. "You are an echo, a machine wearing a corpse. I will not let you poison her mind. She has to know why she's dying today, Corvus." Elian smiled, a hollow, bright expression that didn't reach his golden eyes. Elian raised a single, pale hand. He didn't speak a command. He just snapped his fingers. The air violently rippled. The ruined camp vanished. Suddenly, Yvaine was standing in the center of the Southern Weaver Academy. 10 years ago. It wasn't an illusion. It was a forced projection of reality. She saw her father. She saw Lord Malzar. And she saw hundreds of northern wolves, Corvus's people, chained to massive stone altars, their throats slit. Their blood wasn't falling to the floor. It was flowing upward, defied gravity, funneling directly into the chest of a screaming, terrified 16-year-old boy strapped to a golden chair. "Elian, they didn't want peace." Elian's voice echoed from everywhere at once. "They wanted a god. They needed a weaver vessel strong enough to bend the world. and they used the pure life force of the northern pacts to fuel the ascension. It broke my mind, Yvaine. It burned my soul to ash. The projection violently shattered, snapping them back to the freezing reality of the Deadlands. Yvaine fell to her knees. She couldn't breathe. The air felt too thin. Her entire life, her entire driving purpose, was a lie. She had spent a decade harboring a burning, toxic hatred for the Wolf King of the North. She had walked into his throne room ready to martyr herself to kill the tyrant who ruined her family. But her family were the butchers. She looked up at Corvus. His broad back was to her. He was staring down the god, his hand resting casually on the hilt of his bone blade. "You knew," Yvaine gasped, staring at the back of his dark wolf fur mantle. "You knew what my father did. You knew my bloodline created this. This nightmare." Corvus didn't turn around. "I watched them do it." "Then why did you take the curse?" Yvaine demanded, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you just wipe the South off the map? You're immortal. You could have killed us all, because killing mortals wouldn't stop a god," Corvus snapped. He finally looked over his shoulder at her, his golden eyes blazing with a century of buried rage. "Your father built a weapon that couldn't be killed with swords. So I bound the mountain. I chained my own soul to this dead earth, absorbing the fallout of his magic so the rest of the continent wouldn't be rewritten into a graveyard. I took the curse to cage your brother." Yvaine stared at him, the horrifying truth sinking its claws into her chest. Corvus wasn't a tyrant. He was the warden of a global catastrophe. He had played the villain for 100 years to keep the world safe from her family's ambition. And now? "The cage is breaking," Corvus said coldly, turning back to Elian. "Malzar sent you to me because he knew I needed a weaver to execute the god. He gave me the gun, hoping the recoil would kill us both." Elian reached the bottom of the stairs. The air around him began to warp, gravity distorting so violently that small rocks floated upward into the sky. "It's time to finish the ritual, Yvaine," Elian said, extending a hand toward her. "Give me your spark. Let me unmake this broken world and build us a new one. Just you and me." "Don't look at it," Corvus barked. He drew his blade. The massive bone sword pulsed with a dark, terrifying alpha energy. "It's using your trauma to paralyze you. Time's up, Weaver. Speak the word. Unmake it." Yvaine looked at Elian's hand. She looked at his eyes, the exact same eyes she saw in the mirror every day. I can't," she whispered, her voice shaking uncontrollably. "Corvus, I can't. He's my brother. He is a tumor." Corvus roared, losing his patience completely. The King of the North flared his overwhelming aura, cracking the stone beneath his boots. "Your brother died 10 years ago screaming on an altar. That thing is wearing his skin. Erase it, or millions will die." "Yvaine, please," Elian whispered, a single tear falling down his cheek. It was the exact expression he made when he was scared of the dark as a child. Yvaine clamped her hands over her ears. "Stop! Just give me a second." "We don't have a second." Corvus didn't wait anymore. The god was charging a reality-bending strike, the air literally tearing at the seams around Elian's hands. Corvus moved. He didn't run. He simply vanished into a blur of raw, predatory speed. In a fraction of a second, the Wolf King was airborne, his massive blade raised high, aimed directly at the center of Elian's chest. Lethal, merciless, absolute execution. "No." The scream ripped from Yvaine's throat before she could think. The agonizing instinct of a sister protecting her twin overrode every single piece of logic in her brain. She threw her hands forward. "Murus." "Wal." The weaver's command exploded from her lips. It wasn't aimed at the god. It was aimed at the king. A massive, invisible barricade of pure kinetic force materialized in midair, directly in Corvus's path. The impact was deafening. Corvus slammed into the invisible wall at full speed. The force of the collision shattered the kinetic barrier, but the momentum was entirely broken. The physical blow was brutal. but the magical backlash of the blood pact was catastrophic. Yvaine had just used lethal weaver magic against the man her soul was tied to. The tether connecting their hearts violently snapped like a overloaded power line. Corvus was thrown backward through the air. He hit the black stone floor hard, tumbling twice before coming to a stop. Silence slammed back into the Deadlands. Yvaine lowered her hands, trembling violently. She couldn't breathe. The Wolf King slowly pushed himself up on one knee. His bone blade lay shattered a few feet away. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely, utterly hollowed out. He coughed, and a thick spray of black blood splattered violently onto the white snow. Through the ruined, chaotic hum of the blood pact, Yvaine felt the exact moment his trust in her completely died. Corvus slowly wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He looked up at her. The possessive, terrifying fire that had burned in his golden eyes since the moment he saw her in the throne room was completely gone. Only a cold, dead winter remained. "I warned you," Corvus rasped, his voice a broken, bleeding sound. "I told you what happens if you break the weapon." Behind Yvaine, Elian smiled. "Good girl," the god whispered. Chapter 6. The kinetic wall shattered into a million invisible pieces. Yvaine didn't run. She stood frozen in the snow, her hands still raised, staring at the black blood staining the Wolf King's chin. Malzar's soldiers swarmed the stairs. Two heavy, armored hands grabbed Yvaine's arms, violently jerking her backward. She didn't fight them. Her eyes remained locked on Corvus as he pushed himself up from the ground. "Take her inside," Malzar barked, his face pale with sudden terror. "Move! Get the god into the sanctuary." They dragged Yvaine up the obsidian steps. Corvus didn't pursue them. He stayed on one knee in the snow. He looked down at his chest. The blood pact was still there, but it was ruined. It was no longer a tether of life. It was an open, jagged wound leaking his immortal power directly into the frozen earth. He had chained himself to protect her. She had used that chain to break him. Corvus closed his eyes. His jaw tightened so hard the bone popped. He reached up, his massive, clawed hand hovering directly over his own heart. "If I live, you live." He curled his fingers inward. He didn't tear his flesh. He reached deeper, grabbing the raw, burning thread of his own soul that anchored the pact. With a brutal, agonizing twist, Corvus shattered it. The sound of the invisible chain snapping was louder than thunder. It echoed across the Deadlands, a psychic shockwave that made every soldier on the stairs violently stumble. Yvaine gasped, clutching her chest. The connection was gone. The heavy, protective rhythm of his heart vanished from her mind, replaced by an absolute, terrifying void. She looked back one last time before the massive temple doors slammed shut. Corvus was gone. In his place stood a monster, a colossal black wolf, towering over the ruins of their camp. Its fur wasn't just hair. It was woven from living shadows. Its eyes burned with a blinding, radioactive gold. The wolf threw its massive head back. It didn't howl in mourning. It howled in pure, unadulterated, apocalyptic wrath. The sound rattled the stone walls of the temple. It promised a massacre. The interior of the mountain was an expansive, decaying labyrinth of black stone corridors. Malzar shoved Yvaine forward. "Keep moving. He's right behind us." Yvaine stumbled, catching herself against a damp wall. She ignored Malzar completely. Her eyes frantically searched for the boy walking calmly at the front of their column. "Elian," Yvaine called out. Her voice echoed in the dark. The boy stopped. He didn't turn around. He just tilted his head. "Elian, talk to me," Yvaine begged, her voice cracking. "Tell me you're really in there. Tell me you remember the night before they took you. I hid you under the floorboards." Elian slowly turned. The golden light in his eyes was perfectly flat, static. "The vessel remembers the floorboards," Elian said. His tone was conversational, entirely devoid of emotion. "The vessel remembers the splinter in its left palm, but those data points are no longer relevant, Yvaine. The architecture of this reality must be reformatted." Yvaine stopped breathing. He didn't say I. He said the vessel. "You're not him," Yvaine whispered, the horrific realization dropping her stomach into an endless abyss. "He burned." Elian smiled perfectly. "I am the ash. We are going to build a beautiful world, Yvie. No more wolves, no more pain." He turned and continued walking, floating an inch above the stone floor. Yvaine leaned against the cold wall, her entire body shaking. She had betrayed the king. She had broken the man who literally poured his own life force down her throat to save her. She had shattered his trust for a ghost, for a soulless machine wearing her brother's skin. A heavy metallic crunch echoed from the darkness behind them. Malzar's soldiers froze. Swords cleared their scabbards in terrifying unison. "Light the torches!" Malzar yelled, panic finally cracking his voice. "Form a perimeter!" A soldier threw a spark. A torch flared to life on the wall, casting long, nervous shadows down the corridor. Then, the torch died. It wasn't blown out by the wind. The flame was physically swallowed by a sudden wave of unnatural, freezing darkness. Total pitch black. Yvaine held her breath. A wet, heavy thud sounded 10 feet away. No scream, no struggle, just the horrifying sound of a 200-pound armored man hitting the stone floor like a discarded rag doll. "Who's there?" a soldier screamed, swinging his blade blindly into the dark. Sparks flew as steel hit stone. Another thud. The air grew impossibly cold. The scent of ozone and wet pine flooded the corridor, suffocating and thick. It was him. "Keep moving!" Malzar shoved Yvaine violently. "Get her to the altar room. Now!" The remaining guards dragged her into a dead sprint. Behind them, the psychological slaughter continued. There was no roaring. There was no beastly snarling. The Wolf King hunted in absolute, terrifying silence. Every time the darkness shifted, another guard vanished. The heavy padding of massive paws paced them from the shadows, an invisible predator playing with its prey. The sound of armor crunching under immense jaws echoed off the walls. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. They burst through a set of heavy iron doors, spilling into the inner sanctum of the temple. In the center of the vast, circular room sat a massive slab of white marble, a sacrificial altar, stained with decades of dried, black blood. Elian stood beside it, waiting patiently. Malzar slammed the iron doors shut and threw the heavy deadbolt. He spun around, his face slick with sweat, his eyes wide with cornered desperation. He had exactly 3 guards left out of 20. "We don't have time," Malzar snarled, marching toward Yvaine. He drew a jagged silver dagger from his belt. "He's going to breach those doors in 60 seconds. "Lord Malzar, what are you doing?" Yvaine backed away. "I need your spark," Malzar spat. He grabbed her by the throat and violently slammed her down onto the cold marble altar. The air was knocked from Yvaine's lungs. The remaining guards rushed forward, pinning her wrists and ankles to the stone. "Elian, stop him!" Yvaine screamed, struggling wildly. Elian didn't move. He watched her with hollow, unblinking eyes. "The ritual requires fuel, Yvie. Your compliance is mathematically necessary. He's not your brother, you stupid girl," Malzar sneered, raising the silver dagger high above his head. "He's my puppet, and you are just the battery I need to charge him." Malzar brought the blade down, aiming straight for her heart. Boom. The heavy iron doors didn't just open. They completely detonated. The explosion of kinetic force blew the 300-pound metal slabs entirely off their hinges. They flew across the room, smashing into the stone pillars with a deafening crash. Malzar flinched, the dagger stopping inches from Yvaine's chest. Everyone froze. The dust settled in the doorway. He didn't walk in. The darkness walked in, and he was its master. Corvus stepped over the ruined threshold. He was back in his human form, but he looked completely unhinged. His black tunic was torn, revealing the jagged, magical scar on his chest where the blood pact used to be. His golden eyes were gone, completely swallowed by pitch-black pupils. The heavy, suffocating aura radiating off him wasn't just alpha heat anymore. It was pure, Elemental death. Lord Malzar, Corvus said. His voice was dangerously soft, carrying a vibration that cracked the marble floor beneath his boots. Malzar pressed the dagger firmly against Yvaine's throat. A thin line of blood appeared. "Stay back, wolf." "One step. And I drain her." Corvus didn't stop. He took a deliberate, slow step forward. "Do it," Corvus challenged, tilting his head. A dark, terrifying smile touched his lips. "Cut her throat. Give me a reason to stop playing." Malzar's hand shook violently. Corvus stopped walking. He stared directly at the Lord, the air around him twisting with dark magic. "Touch her again," the Wolf King whispered, a lethal promise echoing through the chamber. "And I will erase your existence so thoroughly, even hell won't remember your name." Chapter 7. Malzar's hand shook violently, but his eyes were completely manic. The silver edge bit a millimeter deeper into Yvaine's neck. A single drop of crimson blood welled up, trailing slowly down her pale skin. Corvus saw the blood. He didn't yell. He didn't draw a weapon. He didn't even shift into his wolf form. He simply let go of the invisible leash holding his raw power back. Crack. The gravity in the room instantly tripled. It wasn't a spell. It was pure, elemental domination, the absolute, crushing weight of the King of the North asserting his authority over physical space. The 3 remaining armored guards slammed face first into the obsidian floor. The sound of their steel breastplates buckling under the invisible pressure echoed like gunshots. Malzar gasped, dropping the silver dagger. He fell hard to his knees, his hands clawing frantically at his own throat as the air was forcibly crushed from his lungs. The bones in his legs groaned under the weight, but Malzar didn't scream. Instead, a wet, bubbling laugh forced its way out of his throat. He glared up at Corvus, blood staining his teeth. "You cannot stop the ascension, beast." Malzar wheezed, his voice carrying a strange, unnatural distortion. "The vessel is full." Corvus ignored him. He walked forward. With every deliberate step he took, the marble floor beneath his boots splintered into massive spiderwebs. The oppressive, freezing aura radiating off him forced the torches along the walls to dim into mere embers. He stopped at the edge of the altar. Yvaine lay on the cold stone. She was shaking, her eyes wide, the thin line of blood on her neck a stark, damning contrast to her pale skin. She didn't try to run. She didn't try to weave a shield. She looked up into the pitch-black, ruined eyes of the tyrant. She knew exactly what she had done. She had broken his trust. She threw up a wall against the man who had poured his own lifespan into her veins, all to protect a machine wearing her dead brother's face. "Get up," Corvus commanded. His voice was a harsh, vibrating rasp. Yvaine slowly pushed herself up. Her hands trembled so badly, she had to grip the jagged edge of the marble altar to steady herself. She looked past his broad shoulders, seeing the blood staining his torn tunic where the blood pact used to be. "I broke the pact," Yvaine said, her voice stripped of all its previous defiance. She closed her eyes, exposing her throat to him. "I threw you to the wolves for a ghost. I accept the penalty." Silence stretched in the ruined temple, heavy and suffocating. Corvus looked down at her. The absolute submission of the fierce weaver who had stabbed him in the chest just days ago twisted something violently inside him. He raised his massive hand. Yvaine braced for the lethal strike. Instead, his rough fingers tangled aggressively into the hair at the nape of her neck. He jerked her forward, crashing his mouth down onto hers. The kiss was brutally fast, desperate, angry, and completely territorial. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a physical adrenaline spike, a violent clash of teeth and breath to forcibly pull her back from the edge of her own guilt. He anchored her body entirely against his, proving to them both that she hadn't killed him. He broke the kiss almost immediately, though his grip on her neck remained ironclad. His chest heaved heavily against hers. "You ran for a ghost," Corvus growled. The pitch black in his eyes receded, bleeding back into a fierce, blinding gold. "But you cannot run from me. Your fate stays exactly where I put it." Yvaine didn't cry. She didn't utter a useless apology. She grabbed the front of his torn tunic, her knuckles turning white, and gave him a single, definitive nod. She was grounded again. A sickening, high-pitched hum suddenly pierced the air, vibrating violently against their teeth. Corvus instantly shifted his massive body, shielding Yvaine completely. At the far end of the chamber, Elian the god was completely unaffected by the crushed gravity. The boy was no longer standing. He was levitating 10 feet in the air. The pristine white and gold robes whipped wildly around him in a sudden, localized hurricane. His golden eyes were glowing so bright they burned like miniature suns. "Error," Elian's voice boomed. It wasn't a teenage boy's voice anymore. It was a terrifying chorus of 1,000 overlapping, metallic voices speaking in absolute, mechanical unison. Anomaly detected in the vessel's emotional core. Eradication protocols engaged. The entire mountain began to violently shake. Huge chunks of black stone tore away from the high ceiling. But they didn't fall to the floor. Mid-air, the rocks dissolved completely into blinding white light, erased from existence before they even hit the ground. Elian slowly raised both hands above his head. The space between his palms turned completely unnaturally black, a sphere of pure, unadulterated antimatter. It swallowed the light, making no sound as it grew larger by the second. "He's going to erase the North," Yvaine breathed, raw terror replacing her guilt. She stared at the silent sphere of nothingness. "Corvus. He's not just going to kill us. He's going to unmake the entire continent." Corvus didn't look at the levitating god. He reached back, his heavy fingers wrapping tight around hers. His golden eyes were steady and unyielding in the face of absolute annihilation. "Then it's time to weave, little bird," Corvus said. Chapter 8. The antimatter sphere above Elian's hands expanded. It made no sound. It simply ate the physical world. The air grew impossibly thin, the light violently sucked into the pitch-black void. Eradication at 50%. The 1,000-voice chorus of the god droned. The mechanical sound vibrated through the floorboards, rattling Yvaine's teeth. Yvaine stepped out from behind Corvus's broad frame. She didn't have a weapon. She only had her voice. "You can't shield against that," Yvaine said, her eyes locked on the expanding sphere of nothingness. "I know," Corvus replied flatly. He didn't step back. He stood between her and the apocalypse, perfectly willing to be erased first. A wet, rattling laugh echoed from the floor. Corvus's gravity magic was still pinning Lord Malzar to the obsidian stone. The Lord's ribs were audibly snapping under the invisible pressure. Blood poured from his nose and mouth, pooling on the dark marble. But Malzar wasn't screaming. He was laughing. You think you can just unwrite him?" Malzar wheezed. His voice violently split. The human tone was abruptly overpowered by a secondary, demonic rasp echoing from deep inside his throat. His jaw unhinged with a sickening pop, stretching far beyond human limits. Corvus narrowed his eyes. He stepped forward and placed his heavy boot directly on Malzar's throat. "Die quietly, parasite. Flesh is fragile, king of the north." "The thing inside," Malzar hissed, smiling a grotesque, bloody smile. "The vessel up there is just a battery. A loud, flashy distraction. I needed you distracted. I needed you in a room where you couldn't run." Corvus pressed his boot down harder, crushing the windpipe. "You talk too much." "Eradication at 80%. Elian's voice boomed above them. The gravity in the room began to invert, pulling loose debris upward into the black sphere. "Weave, Yvaine," Corvus ordered, not looking away from Malzar. "Now." Yvaine raised her hands, but they were shaking uncontrollably. Her breathing turned erratic. "Corvus, if I erase him from the timeline, everything changes. The memories. My childhood. The Weaver magic will violently burn his existence out of my brain. It's going to tear my mind in half." Corvus removed his boot from Malzar's neck. He turned around and walked straight toward her. He didn't offer a soft look of sympathy. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He stepped directly behind her, his massive presence instantly blocking out the freezing draft of the room. Corvus wrapped his heavy arms tightly around her waist, pulling her back until her spine was pressed flush against his solid chest. The overpowering scent of crushed pine and raw, burning alpha heat instantly flooded her senses, fighting off the terrifying cold of the god's magic. He leaned down, pressing his face into the crook of her neck. His sharp claws extended just enough to dig painfully into the flesh of her shoulders. It wasn't an attack. It was an anchor. He was physically pinning her to reality. "Do it!" Corvus growled softly in her ear, his deep voice vibrating straight into her chest. "Let it tear your mind apart. I will be the only memory you need to keep." Yvaine squeezed her eyes shut. She felt the steady, massive rise and fall of his chest against her back. The pain from his claws grounded her. He was right. There was no past left to save. There was only the monster holding her, and the future they had to survive. She opened her eyes and stared directly at the god wearing her brother's face. "Niall." "Nothing." She didn't shout the Weaver's command. She whispered it. The word bypassed sound entirely. It struck the fabric of reality like a guillotine. The pain was instantaneous and absolute. Yvaine screamed as her own mind violently turned against her. It felt like a jagged knife was dragged through her brain, carving out every single memory of her twin brother, the time they hid under the floorboards, the sound of his laugh, the color of his eyes. All of it burst into white-hot ash inside her skull. She collapsed forward, but Corvus held her up, his arms locked around her like iron bands, refusing to let her hit the floor. Above them, the god froze midair. The mechanical hum died. The massive antimatter sphere instantly collapsed inward, vanishing into harmless dust. Elian looked down at his own hands. They were turning transparent, dissolving into glowing white ash. The terrifying, thousand-voice chorus faded. For one split second, the mechanical gold drained from his eyes, and a terrified, human 16-year-old boy looked back at Yvaine. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely at peace. "Thank you, Yvie," the boy whispered. Then, the god shattered. There was no explosion. He simply dissolved into millions of blinding, silent specks of white light, drifting upward toward the ceiling before vanishing completely. He was unmade. He never existed. The agonizing pain in Yvaine's head peaked, and she went entirely limp in Corvus's arms, gasping for air. Black blood dripped heavily from her nose. "It's over," Corvus said. His voice was unusually raw. He turned her around, burying her face against his chest, shielding her from the empty space where her brother used to be. "I've got you." "No," a horrific, overlapping voice hissed from the floor. "It just started." Corvus snapped his head up. Lord Malzar's human body was dead. The neck was broken, the chest caved in. But hovering directly above the corpse was a thick, writhing mass of black, parasitic sludge. It pulsed with ancient, toxic malice. "I told you I needed a distraction, Wolf." The ancient spirit hissed, its form shifting rapidly. "I needed the god to weaken you. I needed your blood pact broken." Corvus shoved Yvaine violently behind him, his bone claws fully extending. He roared, a terrifying, guttural sound that shook the temple walls. But he was too slow. The black sludge didn't attack Yvaine. It shot forward like a bullet, moving faster than sound. It bypassed her entirely and slammed directly into Corvus's chest, striking the exact spot where the torn, unhealed magical wound of their severed blood pact lay exposed. Corvus went completely rigid. A horrifying, unnatural gasp tore from his throat. His massive body arched backward, his hands flying to his chest as if trying to rip the parasite out of his own ribs. He dropped to his knees. The marble floor cracked under the impact. "Corvus!" Yvaine screamed, stumbling forward. "Stay back!" Corvus roared. It wasn't a warning. It was a desperate command. His hands clawed wildly at his own face, tearing his skin. He was fighting a war inside his own mind against a parasite that had just hijacked the strongest, most indestructible immortal vessel on the continent. He looked up at Yvaine. The sight made her blood run entirely cold. His left eye was still his own, burning with fierce, desperate, golden fire. But his right eye was already gone, swallowed by a hollow, dead black void. "Run!" Corvus choked out. His fangs bared in absolute agony as his muscles violently spasmed. The veins in his neck turned pitch black. "Run, Yvaine. I can't hold it." His voice violently cut off. Corvus's head snapped down. His massive hands stopped tearing at his face and slowly lowered to his sides. The violent trembling of his body abruptly ceased. Dead silence filled the ruined temple. Yvaine backed away, her breath catching in her throat. "Corvus?" Slowly, the Wolf King stood up. He rolled his broad shoulders, a sickening crack echoing from his spine. When he looked up at her, the golden fire was completely gone. Both of his eyes were pitch black. A sinister, completely unfamiliar smile stretched across Corvus's face. "He can't hear you anymore, Weaver," the King of the North said. The voice was his, but the demonic, overlapping tone belonged to the parasite. "And I must say, this vessel is magnificent." Chapter 9. The possessed king stepped forward. The marble floor didn't just crack under his boots. It disintegrated into fine dust. A century of suppressed power. The overlapping demonic voice hissed from Corvus's lips. He raised his massive hands, flexing the bone-crushing claws, admiring the immortal vessel he had just stolen. He caged himself in the cold. What a tragic, pathetic waste. Yvaine couldn't breathe. The sheer, suffocating pressure of Malzar's ancient malice, combined with Corvus's alpha aura, was paralyzing. The parasite turned Corvus's pitch-black eyes toward her. "You have no more words left, little Weaver," Malzar sneered. "Your mind is bleeding out. I'm going to use his hands to snap your neck. And then I'm going to burn your world." He lunged. The King of the North moved with blinding, predatory speed. His claws aimed directly for her throat. Yvaine didn't even have time to blink, but inches from her skin, his arm violently jerked to a halt. The claws stopped mid-air, trembling so hard the bones popped. Corvus's entire body went rigid. A horrific, agonizing groan tore from his throat. The left eye violently flickered, the dead black void fighting against a sudden, blazing spark of gold. The Wolf King was fighting his own hijacked body. "Kill me," Corvus choked out. His real voice bled through the demonic distortion, raw and desperate. He forced his own arm down, fighting the parasite's control, and violently slammed himself to his knees before her. "Pick up the blade, Yvaine. Pierce the heart." Yvaine stared at the shattered pieces of his bone sword scattered across the floor. Then she looked at the monster she had hated for 10 years, now begging for death just to keep her safe. "No." Yvaine kicked the broken blade away. "Do it," Corvus roared, his claws digging deep into his own thighs to stop himself from attacking her. Black veins throbbed violently up his neck. "I can't hold him, strike!" "I am done killing my own," Yvaine whispered. She didn't run. She stepped directly into his striking range, entirely ignoring the lethal danger. She pressed 2 fingers, glowing with a blinding, white-hot weaver's spark, directly against the unhealed, jagged wound on his chest where their blood pact had broken. Operi. Open. Reality folded instantly. The ruined temple, the cold stone, the roaring wind, everything vanished. Yvaine was violently sucked into the absolute darkness of the Wolf King's mind. When she opened her eyes, she was standing in an endless, freezing wasteland of black ice and falling ash. The psychic projection of a century of total isolation. In the center of the frozen expanse, Corvus was chained to a massive obsidian throne. He wasn't held by iron. He was bound by thick, writhing black sludge, Malzar's parasitic soul. The darkness was aggressively burrowing into his chest, eating its way into his core, rewriting his memories into ash. Corvus looked up. He didn't look like a terrifying tyrant here. He looked entirely broken. Exhausted from holding up the sky for 100 years, his spirit finally collapsing under the weight. "Get out," Corvus growled. his voice echoing across the endless ice. "It will consume you too." Yvaine walked forward. "You are in an immortal's mind, mortal." Malzar's demonic voice boomed from the dark sky above, shaking the ground. "You have no power here. You are just meat." Yvaine ignored the voice. She ignored the black sludge, snapping aggressively at her ankles. She walked straight to the obsidian throne and dropped to her knees in front of Corvus. She reached out, her hands gently tracing the jagged, bleeding psychic wounds the curse had left on his mind. "You've been alone in the dark for 100 years, Yvaine said softly, her voice the only warm thing in the entire wasteland. "You played the villain so they would hate you instead of hunting my family. You took the curse for us. Leave, Yvaine," Corvus begged, closing his eyes, unable to look at her. "Let me fall. I am not leaving you in the dark." Yvaine stepped completely into the black sludge. She didn't use a weaver word to attack. She used her own soul. She wrapped her arms tightly around his neck, pulling his head down until their foreheads pressed together. A blinding, golden light erupted from her chest. It wasn't a weapon. It was an absolute, impenetrable shield. The golden spark of the Fate Weaver violently expanded, wrapping completely around the obsidian throne, encapsulating Corvus in a burning, protective warmth. The black sludge screamed as the light touched it, violently burning away into nothing, forcefully evicted from his mind. "I am a Fate Weaver," Yvaine whispered fiercely, her eyes locking onto his golden ones, refusing to let him look away. "No curse gets to claim you, and no parasite gets to write your destiny." She pressed her glowing hand directly over his heart. "I write your end," she declared. She turned her head toward the dark sky, glaring at the suffocating presence of Lord Malzar. Fractura. Shatter. The golden shield violently exploded outward like a supernova. The shockwave obliterated the freezing wasteland. The black ice shattered. The dark sky tore open, flooded by blinding, purifying white light. Malzar's psychic presence shrieked in absolute, agonizing terror before being completely crushed from the inside out. Yvaine was violently thrown back into reality. She hit the marble floor of the temple hard. A few feet away, Corvus gasped violently, arching off the stone floor. A horrific, high-pitched scream tore from his mouth, Malzar's final death rattle. Thick, rotting black smoke erupted from Corvus's eyes, his mouth, his chest, violently expelled from his body, and instantly dissolving into harmless ash in the air. Corvus collapsed onto his hands and knees, coughing violently. The pitch-black voids in his eyes were completely gone. The fierce, pure gold returned, burning brighter than ever. He was entirely his own again. The air in the room cleared, the oppressive, demonic aura completely neutralized. He had his mind back. He looked up, his chest heaving. Yvaine. She was lying on the floor, perfectly still. The golden spark on her fingertips had entirely faded. The toll of unmaking a god and acting as the ultimate shield against an ancient parasite crashed into her mortal body all at once. Her eyes were closed. Her skin was turning terrifyingly pale, the temperature of her body rapidly dropping to match the freezing air of the dead room. Corvus scrambled across the shattered marble. He didn't care about his own wounds. He pulled her limp body entirely into his lap, his massive hands frantically gripping her face. "Yvaine!" Corvus rasped, his voice cracking. He pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. There was no pulse. She was completely, entirely cold. Chapter 10. There was no pulse. Corvus pressed his fingers harder against Yvaine's icy neck, his hands trembling violently. Nothing. The fragile, mortal rhythm that had been echoing in his own chest just hours ago was completely silent. He stared at her pale face. The weaver who had broken a god. The girl who had walked into the darkest, most ruined part of his mind and dragged him out of hell. She was gone. No, Corvus didn't scream. He didn't howl in grief. Grief was for the helpless. And the king of the north was no longer chained. With Malzar dead, and the god unmade, the ancient curse binding his soul to the mountain was permanently shattered. A century of suppressed, infinite alpha power violently rushed back into his veins. It didn't just heat his blood, it turned his entire body into a blinding, radioactive furnace of raw life force. He gathered Yvaine fully into his arms, crushing her lifeless body against his chest. "You do not get to leave me," Corvus growled. His voice shook the foundations of the ruined temple. He didn't hesitate. He brought his right wrist to his mouth and sank his own fangs deep into his flesh. He tore the skin wide open. This wasn't a forced blood pact. This wasn't a desperate transfer of energy. This was an absolute, irreversible soul bind. Liquid gold, pure, unfiltered immortality spilled from his wrist, glowing so fiercely it banished the shadows from the chamber. Corvus forced his bleeding wrist over Yvaine's pale lips, letting the burning gold slide past her teeth. "Take it," he commanded, his golden eyes blazing with a terrifying, unyielding obsession. "Take all of it." He didn't wait for her body to react. He dropped his wrist, framed her face with his massive hands, and crashed his mouth over hers, forcibly breathing his own breath, his own burning soul, directly into her lungs. He poured a century of hoarded life force into her fragile, mortal shell. The air in the temple superheated. The marble floor beneath them glowed white-hot. Thump! A single, weak heartbeat echoed against his chest. Corvus gripped her tighter, his claws digging into her shoulders. "Again! Weaver! Breathe!" Thump, thump. Yvaine's back violently arched off his lap. She gasped, a desperate, sharp intake of air that sounded like tearing silk. Her eyes snapped open. They weren't just silver anymore. The irises were ringed with a fierce, burning gold, his gold. The heat of the alpha raged through her veins, entirely burning away the cold touch of death. She grabbed the front of his torn tunic, her chest heaving as she sucked in the air. "Corvus," she choked out, her voice raw. He didn't say a word. He looked at the golden rings in her eyes. She was alive. She was his. Corvus buried his face in the crook of her neck. He didn't kiss her gently. He opened his mouth, his fangs extending, and sank them deeply, definitively, into the soft skin directly over her pulse. Yvaine cried out, her head falling back. It wasn't pain. It was a searing, explosive heat that instantly branded her soul. The mating mark locked into place, a permanent, unbreakable tether crashing through both of their minds. The scent of crushed pine and raw ozone violently collided with the smell of rain and silver magic. She wrapped her arms tightly around his broad shoulders, holding the monster against her, anchoring him as completely as he anchored her. "Mine." Corvus rasped against her marked skin, his voice a possessive, vibrating purr. Yvaine ran her fingers through his thick hair, her golden silver eyes fierce. "Only yours." 1 month later, the heavy, ironwood doors of the Great Hall of the North swung open. The murmurs of 1,000 assembled lords, pack alphas, and southern emissaries died instantly. Absolute, deafening silence fell over the massive room. No one dared to breathe. Yvaine walked down the center aisle. She didn't wear the simple linen of a southern tribute, nor the heavy armor of a northern soldier. She wore a stunning, floor-length gown of midnight blue silk, draped with an immaculate white wolf fur mantle. Her spine was perfectly straight, her eyes, glowing with that terrifying, hybrid gold-silver light, commanded the entire room without her speaking a single word. She walked past the kneeling rows of absolute power. She saw Phaedra in the crowd, leaning against a pillar, giving a sharp, approving smirk. She saw Gunnar, the massive beta, bowing his head so low his forehead nearly touched the stone. Yvaine reached the dais. She turned and sat directly on the towering obsidian throne. A collective, silent shock rippled through the southern emissaries. A weaver on the throne of the Wolf King. It was unprecedented. It was dangerous. The heavy doors at the back of the hall opened again. The temperature in the room instantly plummeted. The air grew dense, suffocating, entirely saturated with a lethal, dominating alpha aura. Corvus walked in. He wore no crown. He wore his usual dark leathers, his massive bone blade strapped across his back. The jagged scar on his chest was visible beneath his tunic, a brutal reminder of the weapon who had broken him and put him back together. The crowd didn't just kneel. They pressed themselves completely flat against the floor. Corvus ignored them all. His golden eyes were locked entirely on the woman sitting on the throne. He reached the dais. The southern emissaries held their breath, expecting the tyrant to order her off his seat, expecting him to take his rightful place at the peak of the empire. Corvus didn't walk up the final step. He stopped right at the base of the throne. He turned his back to the thousands of terrified subjects in the hall. Slowly, casually, the immortal king of the north sat down on the cold stone step, directly at Yvaine's feet. He leaned his broad back heavily against her shins, making himself entirely comfortable. A collective, internal gasp echoed through the room, though no one made a sound. Yvaine didn't flinch. She simply rested her hand naturally on his shoulder, her fingers absently tracing the thick collar of his tunic. Corvus pulled a small, wicked-looking bone dagger from his belt. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a bright red apple, and began to slowly, methodically peel it. He didn't look at the crowd. He tilted his head back, resting it against Yvaine's knee, and looked up into her eyes. A dark, incredibly proud smile curved his lips. "The world calls me a tyrant, little bird," Corvus murmured. His voice was low, but in the dead silent hall, it carried to every single corner. He offered her a slice of the apple on the tip of his lethal blade. "Let them call you my god,"